Scheduling. Even if you're the only developer working on your application, it's important to follow some basic project management principles. The best way to create estimates is to break down your work into smaller tasks. The size of each task will depend on your experience level. The smaller the tasks you create, the better your accuracy will be. You'll find that some tasks will take longer than expected, while others will go more quickly. In the end, they should more or less even themselves out, and you'll hopefully complete the project on time. At the very least, if things are taking longer than expected, you'll know sooner rather than later that you're falling behind schedule. When estimating the time required for each of the tasks, it's important to factor in a buffer. You can analyze your past results to determine how much buffer to add. This should account for unforeseen problems. The order of your tasks is also extremely important. Although it's tempting to start with the more interesting challenges, it's better to work on the riskier items first. Finally, you can't talk about software management without mentioning the mythical man month. In a nutshell, adding developers to a project will, initially at least, slow it down. New developers need training, which will distract your experienced programmers. Every developer added creates additional communication overhead. A small team of great programmers can outperform a large team of mediocre programmers any day. User interfaces. The key to designing good user interfaces is making sure that your interface matches the user's mental model. Steve Krug said it best in the title of his book, Don't Make Me Think. Users have been trained by every application they've used before yours, and they expect your application to work the same way. This is one area where innovation should be applied cautiously. Good design is about making decisions on behalf of your users. You can't simply make everything an option in the settings. As with your code, your graphical interfaces should be as simple as possible. While this may sound easy in principle, in practice, this can sometimes be quite challenging. Design should be an iterative process by which you continually refine the interface, stripping away the clutter until you're left with the bare essentials. Again, as with code, white space is critical. It divides up your interface into digestible sections. We've all seen websites where every space on the page is filled with something. The more you show your users, sometimes the less they see. The same applies to text messages. Less is more. Users simply don't read. Keep your text as terse as possible, and even then, assume your users won't read it. A key goal in interface design is enabling your users to be as productive as possible. A great example of good versus bad design is the search feature in earlier versions of Internet Explorer versus Firefox. In Internet Explorer, if a search failed, the user was blocked by a modal dialog box and then needed to click a button to search again. In Firefox, the background just turns red. While professional focus groups are pretty expensive, you can get most of the benefit just by calling in Rich from accounting. Make it fun for them. Everyone likes to get away from work for a bit. You'll sometimes be shocked by what people try to do. It can be a great learning experience. Lastly, remember that the mouse can be hard to use even by dexterous people. One of the differences between Macs and Windows is that on the Mac, the menu bar of an application is always at the top of the screen. This gives it essentially infinite height. Throw your mouse at the top of the screen and you can't miss it. Windows originally managed the complete opposite by having a single pixel gap below the Start button, making it that much harder to click. Environment. As coders, we spend the vast majority of our time at our desks working on our computers. It therefore makes a lot of sense to invest a bit of time making sure your environment is as efficient as possible. First and foremost, make sure you're using a fast enough computer. Having to wait for your application to compile adds up over time. Additionally, if you keep your compile time to under a couple of seconds, you're far less likely to browse Reddit while you wait for your compilation to complete. If you like to tinker under the hood, installing a custom CPU cooler allows you to significantly overclock your CPU. Size really does matter when it comes to screens. There have been numerous studies which have proven that larger screens significantly improve performance. Speak to your boss about getting an upgrade. It's definitely in their best interest. Consider turning off email alerts and checking your email every hour. Although responding to an email may only take you 15 seconds, context switching creates a much greater penalty. As coders, we're constantly juggling numerous classes, functions, and variables in our head, essentially modeling the code in our mind. Having to stop, even briefly, can create a serious delay when getting started again. It's worth making sure that your setup is as ergonomic as possible and that you're using all 10 fingers to type. Speaking from personal experience, I was blazing as a hunt and peck typist, but ended up with a severe case of tendonitis. The solution for me was to learn to type using the data hand keyboard. This involved quite a steep learning curve, but it was definitely worth it. Hopefully, you won't need to take such drastic measures, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. As much as possible, try to use keyboard shortcuts. Switching back and forth between the mouse and the keyboard can be the source of a lot of wrist strain. It's also just a lot quicker. It goes without saying that you should use some form of version control, Git being a current favorite. In addition, it can be helpful to keep your code in a Dropbox folder, so your changes are saved to the cloud automatically. If your application relies on a remote service, taking the time at the beginning to mock the data always pays off in the long run. It enables you to work when you're offline or when the service is down, and it makes it easier to test out different responses as well as performing more quickly. If you SSH into a number of different servers, here are the steps required to use a shared key. This prevents you from having to type your password constantly throughout the day. But if you do this, ensure your computer itself is secure. Make sure your deployment process is easy and reversible. Capistrano for Ruby on Rails is a great example of how good it can be. It makes deployment a one-step process, and it's incredibly simple to roll back a change. For task management, the Getting Things Done, or GTD approach, is definitely worth taking a look at. And for time management, many people swear by the Pomodoro technique. Whichever approaches you choose, just make sure all pending tasks are written down. As much as possible, you want to try to free your mind from having to worry about remembering things and focus your energy on creating. Growth. A great way to develop is to learn a new language. Each language provides its own benefits. When thinking about which language to learn next, there are two great sites to check out. The one Google generally returns is Tiobi.com. It shows you the popularity of different languages. But another great site to use is Indeed.com. It gives you a sense of the marketplace for jobs. Part of our growth comes from improving our coding skills, but it's just as important to grow emotionally. We need to learn to accept changes and appreciate that sometimes it's only through having created the application and then getting a chance to play with it that you figure out how it needs to be changed for the better. You should try to look at each change as an opportunity to make the piece of code that you touch better than you found it. Constantly refactoring to improve the code. We learn from failure, not from success. Although we get to spend vast quantities of time alone with our computer, there are times when we have to interact with other people. For what it's worth, I'm a strong believer in the value of having a drink with a coworker after work. Safely, of course. As for algorithms, you owe it to yourself to read How to Win Friends and Influence People. It breaks down human interaction into an exact science. Finally, if you haven't done so already, start a blog. Even if you have nothing to say, simply having the output can sometimes create the input.